Try to imagine a ceasefire so fragile that even a single airstrike or holding back on aid could reignite war, or a United States president proposing to turn Gaza into a Riviera by displacing millions. That's the story of Gaza in March of 2025. Chaos is fomenting everywhere, and really nobody knows the direction that it's going. I'm your host, Sal Assante. This is the We The Patriots Podcast, and today we're going to do our update on the situation in Gaza between Israel and Palestine. So for those of you that haven't been following all the way along, I will link the other shows that I've done on the Israel-Palestine conflict. That has started as of October 2023, going on about a year and a half now. Could be coming up on 2 years, depending on if these ceasefires turn permanent or not. And in this entirety of this conflict, it has been bloodshed on both sides, but particularly for the Palestinians when you're looking at the numbers. And realistically, it doesn't really seem like there's an end in sight, unfortunately, and especially not a good one. We'll get into it today and talk a little bit about the rise of Hamas, how Hamas even started, where it came from, what Trump has been trying to do since he got into the White House, trying and failing in certain circumstances, maybe succeeding. I wouldn't really say that so much, but we'll get into it. And we'll also talk a little bit about how Israel has been treating the conflict. As we get into it, we're going to talk about, like I said, Hamas, how they actually started, which is going to have to go back to the Oslo Accords of the 90s. And we're going to also have to talk a little bit about how Gaza's looking right now. We're going to try to get this done in about a half hour. I don't really want to drag this on too long. But again, if you need a little bit of background or you want to get a little bit more history involved, please go look at the other episodes that I've done on this topic. It has been expansive. We're probably going on about 3 hours of content total. And yeah, let's get right into the thick of things. So Hamas itself actually started in 1987 during the first Intifada. It was born out of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza underneath, and I apologize because I'm going to butcher this, but it was Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Now, what we're going to have to learn, and I'll get into it in a little bit, is how Yassin actually was the front of a group that was not militant. And that's kind of important as we look into whether Israel is to blame for the existence of Hamas, and not just by existing as Israel. Now, something that caught my eye that was pretty recent was a resurfacing of a video, an older video of Ron Paul.
You'll find out that Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat.
And this video of Ron Paul was him essentially saying that Israel funded Hamas, that Hamas only exists because of Israel, and now Israel set up to fight Hamas, and that this whole situation between Palestine, Israel, recent, I should say, because that clip is from somewhere around 2007, 2008. The whole constant fighting going on between people in Gaza and Israel is Israel's fault. Israel created this conflict, that they backed it, they wanted this conflict. And well, we'll get into a little bit of the specifics here, but what I want you to understand is that it's a little more nuanced than just saying that Israel paid for it. Now, can we talk about the idea of Israel wanting some sort of militant group constantly fighting against them? Yes, and I think that's important to talk about right now before we go any further. Is there a good point to be made, or is there any point to be made that Israel benefits from having adversaries constantly against them? I would say yes. Why is it yes? Well, if you look back on the history, the ability for Israel to control the Western media, and generally speaking, we're talking about the Western media, you are mostly affecting the United States, their biggest donor over the years, of course, but even broader speaking, if you affect the populace of the United States and you can get them on your side, generally speaking, you're going to be able to change the way that things are looked at on an international scale. And this recent conflict has actually shifted a lot of how many Americans think about the conflict, and maybe it'll shift the way that Israel is actually targeting these foes. Now, what they've done in Gaza in terms of the destruction and the displacement of millions of people is nothing really new. As I've detailed in shows past, you can go get the details on that. If you look back in years past, the amount of times that Israel has been in conflict and armed conflict with Palestinian groups, and specifically from Gaza, or talking about the West Bank as well, probably once every 2 to 4 years or so, relatively speaking. Now, there wasn't any active conflicts, straight up conflicts like declarations of war underneath Trump's first presidency, but that does not mean that there was not militant groups attempting to cause unrest in Israel or by Israel causing unrest elsewhere. That being said, that was probably one of the longer gaps. I remember that there were multiple instances under Obama. There was, of course, initial uprise of Hamas, which I believe was in 2006 when they finally won their election, 2005 actually. We'll get into that a little bit further, but my whole point in saying all this is Israel benefits by having basically a scapegoat in order to pit against, make sure that the Western media is always focused on the militant agitators rather than Israel themselves. And if you make an argument there that them propping up Hamas, setting up Hamas in the first place could be beneficial to Israel, absolutely. Why is that the case? Well, again, it's nuanced. It's not straight up, but when you're thinking about how Israel has been fomenting this war over decades at this point, they need a scapegoat. They need someone to fight against. Otherwise, they will just exist and not really have any conflict to show the world. And a lot of times, once that happens, people start digging into the not so great things that Israel themselves doing, participating in. And that is not the place, if you are thinking about why Israel might want this, that is not the place Israel wants to be. They do not want the microscope on them all the time. They would rather have the microscope on the militant groups, on the terrorists, as many people in the West, especially in the United States, like to refer to Islamic extremists. And yeah, so that's their benefit there. Now, can we look at Ron Paul's claim that Israel funded Hamas? It's not direct, at least not what's published in the public for public eyes to see. However, they did fund the leader. So if we look back on Yassin, who, as I mentioned before, was the original creator, I think I mentioned in the intro, I hope I did. Yassin actually led a different group, and this was actually before the 1987 creation of Hamas. This group's name was Mujama al-Islamiyah. Definitely butchered the name there again, but come at me, come and tell me how to say it. I would rather know and say it properly. But this group was actually a peacetime group, or at least a peace-seeking group. And what I mean by that is that they were in charge of the creation of colleges, universities, schools, mosques, hospitals. And they actually had some very good things going for them, right? At least that's what they made public. Now, the same leader also is charged with starting Hamas. So when that happened in 1987, was no longer funding them. And now the group of Mujama actually lasted back into the 70s and into the early 80s. But once Hamas was actually created, it seemed pretty obvious that Israel was no longer going to fund them, at least not publicly. And that does seem to be the case in terms of what was published on paper. Now, that doesn't mean that there were a couple of instances where they basically allowed like Saudi funds, Qatari funds to flow into Hamas's hands, especially as the leaders of Gaza. But all being told, you look at direct funding from Israel, they did not directly fund Hamas. Does Ron Paul have a point, or others that make claims very similar to him, that basically, paraphrasing here, but Hamas is Israel's creation? Yes, they have a point, and especially when you think about a lot of what Zionist type of, I'll call them propagandists, what Zionist people like to claim now is that it doesn't matter if you're giving them humanitarian aid, them being Hamas or people in Gaza, eventually the money's going to flow down or be of use to Hamas. Now, does that have some legitimacy? Yeah, it does have some. But that being said, if you have money ear tagged going for humanitarian support, you have aid going in, food, medical supplies. Yeah, I mean, you're going to end up treating some of the militants, but you're also really helping out the people that live there. And that's where you run into the problems of Israel actually basically blockading and stopping the current aid of going in. I think a very decent argument from many Palestinian either supporters or Palestinian people in general that Israel doesn't have a right to do that. In a lot of cases, Israel actually controls what goes in and out of Gaza. And if that's the case, then it is their duty to make sure that the people have what they need to survive, which of course would be food, shelter, and medical supplies as well. Good schooling, you could say as well. Another large problem here is that Israel essentially attempted to dismantle the PLO. And in doing so, they created many other groups underneath or fragmenting from the PLO. One of them, of course, being Hamas. And what Zionist leaders, as well as the United States, like to call this strategy was the divide and rule strategy, and it kind of blew up in their face. It's a pretty big problem if you're looking at it from the modern day and how this issue, again, that's lasted since 1948, since the creation and since the original war in Israel was, according to Israelis, was waged upon them, why this war seems to be everlasting, never really going to go away. And part of that is looking back on this divide and rule strategy, where you're basically trying to take apart the factions that are against Israel and put them against each other, cause infighting. And again, it's kind of blown up in their face in terms of what's going on with Hamas, constant barrage of attacks, which is actually a thing that goes into Tel Aviv constantly. Why the Iron Dome even exists, if you don't know what the Iron Dome is, it's one of the missile defense systems that is in place in Israel. That way that if a missile is spotted and looks like it has a trajectory of hitting a populated area in Israel, the Iron Dome shoots that missile out of the sky. Now, what's important for understanding some of the history here is the Oslo Accords. Now, Oslo Accords were actually underneath Bill Clinton. Oslo I, which was in 1993, and Oslo II, which was 1995. Essentially what this turned out to be is a handshake deal between Israel and the PLO. What it was a mutual recognition and kind of an attempt at a two-state solution. Now, they still did not agree on borders, did not agree on Jerusalem, and kind of kicked that can down the road. That being said, they had basically three different groups of territory, or three different groups of places. One would be like Group A, which is, I believe, would be controlled by Hamas or PLO leaders. Group B would be Palestinian people living there underneath Israeli defense. And then Group C being totally controlled by Israel and defended by Israel. So you had three different classifications of area underneath these Oslo Accords. And the first vote, of course, took place in 1996. Now, Palestinian Authority election was 1996. Fatah actually won. At least they won the majority of seats. And it actually wasn't until 2006 that Hamas took over in the Palestinian Authority. And since then, I don't believe there has been a vote. I could be wrong on that. You can correct me in the comments here. Since then, that actually wasn't pushed by Israel. So it wasn't really, can you make the claim here that even if their money did flow to help set up Hamas, can you even make the claim that Israel pushed for a vote backfired? Not really. It's actually the United States pushing heavily under Bush administration to get another vote to go since the 1996 election. And this is where Hamas actually took over in 6. And then once they actually split up the territories of the West Bank and Gaza, because there was actually still in the West Bank a higher majority by the Palestinian Authority or PLO, and essentially split from Hamas's rule. Hamas essentially only rules over Gaza, and that actually lasts until today. Now, if we look at the current state of Gaza, it is a disaster zone. If we're just being completely frank, being honest about how everything is looking, they've destroyed about 80% of homes and buildings. Healthcare is completely decimated. They've recently had a ceasefire that was supposed to start on the 19th of January. That was actually negotiated on one of the last days of the Biden presidency. It was supposed to be a 3-phase plan. Phase 2 was supposed to start March 2nd and March 1st. I apologize. And with that, essentially what has been claimed by Israel is that the amount of hostages, or which I believe I actually mentioned in a very recent episode. I don't know if I'll be able to go find that, but go ahead and listen to all the episodes of We The Patriots. You'll catch up on where I'm at here. Essentially, a claim made by Israel was that the state of the hostages coming back to Israel, or the amount, has not been adequate, and thus they're not going to agree to a permanent ceasefire. And you actually saw that being demonstrated by a March 14th airstrike by Israel, killing 4, and on top of that, actually halting aid going into Gaza. This is where you actually run into a lot of the military tactics that are still going on today. It seems like phase 1 was supposed to end on March 1st, heading into a permanent ceasefire as a part of phase 2. It seems like we're not there yet. Just looking on the outset, again, you have an airstrike that goes on. I would say that military options have not ceased. Military operations, I apologize, and cutting off aid to civilians is still an act of war in my eyes, and I'm sure underneath most international bodies' recognition. Part of this is that Israel wants to completely destroy Hamas. Now, I don't know who to attribute this to exactly, so I'm going to paraphrase this, but I think it's pretty obvious to those of us who have been paying attention here, and that is that, especially coming from the United States, I will clarify, coming from the United States that spent about 20 years in Afghanistan, utterly failed, especially in terms of our pullout underneath the Biden administration. If you were to kill one or two terrorists, all you do is birth 10 more, 20 more. And that's kind of the problem I think that Israel is going through now. Now, if you're going to look back on the creation of Israel and some of the, I would say, terroristic actions that they actually took upon themselves in order to claim more land or in order to solidify their takeover of what would be deemed the Palestinian land, it's very, very hard to look at, I would say, in terms of an American Western mindset, or even from the Zionist point of view. And many times they won't even mention that the things happened because it is, again, it's kind of part of that ugly behind the scenes part that nobody really wants anybody to talk about, especially from the point of view of Israel. Now, from the point of view of Palestinian, they want to talk about that all day long, and they don't really want to talk about the Islamic extremism that actually exists in Gaza and really throughout the Islamic world. The ceasefire is a good step, I would say. That has to be. It's better than constant fighting, but if you look at the total destruction, I already mentioned the amount of infrastructure that's been damaged. You're looking at, again, something like 80% of homes. Most hospitals, mosques have been brutally destroyed. But you actually look at the loss of life here is pretty troubling. You're looking at about 1,600 Israeli deaths, roughly, since 2023. And that's including, I believe, the original estimate is around 1,100 or so Israeli deaths on that October 7th attack. Now, let's look at the Palestinian deaths, and this is where it gets a little bit mind-blowing, I would say. You have about 47,000 plus estimated Palestinian deaths. And when you think about that, and obviously a scale of roughly 40 to 1 in terms of Palestinian deaths, maybe more like 35 to 1, but still Palestinian deaths to Israeli deaths. And you can see that the scale of this war has been really taken to another level, especially by Israel and their actions. Now, Israel wants to claim is that most of these people are militants that they've killed. Palestinians, or Gazans are going to claim is that most of these people are civilians. And I would venture to say that that old adage of there's your side, my side, and the truth, I'd say the truth lies somewhere in the middle there. And that middle ground might not actually be as pretty as anybody wants to admit. If I had to guess, there's a lot more civilian deaths than anybody wants to really admit, anybody in the West anyway, and probably not as extreme as the Gazans or the Palestinians, or possibly if you're talking about the famous one, of course, on the Islamic or Palestinian side is Al Jazeera. If I had to wager, it probably isn't to the estimates that they are putting out, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a point. And the point being is that Israel definitely attacks civilians, definitely puts civilians in harm's way by attacking places like schools, hospitals. Even if these places were the breeding ground of Hamas operations, that doesn't mean you're not putting innocent lives in the mix or in the way of deadly fire. And that has led to these massive numbers in terms of death, and of course gets scary for us looking from the outside in. When you're looking at the U.S.'s involvement, especially since Trump has taken over, again, you had that original ceasefire negotiated, or the three-phase ceasefire aiming at peace that was negotiated by Biden, actually overseen by Egypt, Saudi, and the Egypt, Saudi, and Qatari forces essentially backing that plan. Again, that plan hasn't really gone into the trajectory that people were expecting, especially since phase 2 is basically impossible with Israel launching airstrikes at this moment. Now, since January 20th, which is when Trump actually got into office, Trump actually put out some pretty interesting things, and I would say some pretty condemnable things out, both in speech and on social media. So I don't know if you guys all kind of heard this or at least heard about it, but what he was saying is that he's looking at the U.S. running Gaza, basically taking over, making it a U.S.-led Riviera, and in doing this, displacing about 2.2 million people, basically having the United States lead the revitalization of the area. And this was looked at pretty negatively from what I could tell by all sides. Nobody really wanted U.S. involvement in this conflict to go any further other than negotiating a peace deal. And then you also look at the funding that has been coming from the U.S. Now, on top of the yearly aid comes from the United States. Again, I think that's somewhere, referencing back to old shows, so I could be off my figure, but somewhere in the ballpark of $3 to $4 billion a year just in yearly aid, regardless of what situation that they're in. And you're talking about $4 billion of additional military assistance and actually looking at a deal of selling roughly $12 billion worth to Israel. So that's not a grant, but it is aid being given by the United States to Israel. And this has all been under Trump, and pretty stark contrast to the tone that's been taken against or with Ukraine, I should say, as I mentioned in previous episode. But it makes you wonder what the end goal is. There an end goal of this, right? As you're going to hear, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu constantly says that our goal is the destruction of Hamas. But I call back to a statement made by myself about 5 minutes ago here, which is, you're going to kill a terrorist, you're going to create 10 more. And the whole point with saying that, I hope you guys are understanding where I'm going with that. But if not, if you kill someone, they have family members. If you kill someone, they have friends. And those friends who may not have been fully radicalized, that see their friend get shot either innocently or maybe not even innocently, they are going to turn against whatever force committed sin. And that's how you have the creation of new terrorists. And really, you think you're going to be decimating an operation or a organization like Hamas by taking off the top and taking out the heads of leadership. And realistically, what you're actually doing is just creating a new vacuum for power to be taken by the next most aggressive person, unfortunately. So my whole point there is calling out the Israeli government, but also I think it's important to temper down the expectations of President Trump here, or others that are in his cabinet or leading with him, understanding that there is no end to this. The more war that's waged against the Palestinian people, against the Muslim nations as a whole, the more they're going to want to fight back. And it's kind of stupid for us, in my opinion, to continue pursuing policy that's going to be putting these people in harm's way. So as we get into this, again, Trump thinking about owning Gaza got a lot of backlash. And I don't know if you guys saw this, but there was a video posted onto the Trump accounts, which I believe is still up, which is insane. So go get a look at that. I'm not going to post it on this show here, but it was essentially a AI-derived possibility of the future of Gaza. There was a Trump golden statue, which if that doesn't bother you, it should, even if you're not a Christian or even believer in any sort of the Bible. You could be Muslim, you could be Jewish. If you don't see that as a problem and basically alluding to yourself as the golden calf, then I don't know what you're seeing. And then on top of that, it was essentially a U.S. haven. And again, kind of going to resort back to his own language there, a U.S.-led Riviera. And that received so much backlash. And I'm happy because to me, again, U.S. involvement in that area has been only negative. We saw again, I'll allude to it, the absolute failure that was in Afghanistan and the pullout that happened that granted Islamic extremists our weaponry, our technology for no good reason. And and all I can think of is that when I start thinking about Trump pitching basically the United States taking over Gaza. Now, a direct reaction to this was many Muslim-run nations were not happy with this. For one of the major ones being Egypt. They actually, I think, immediately retorted with a proposal of about $53 billion split between them, Saudi Arabia, Qataris, in order to rebuild the area of Gaza. Now, what also took place was direct conversations between the United States and Hamas leaders. Allegedly, it's the first time that this actually happened. And what you have to also understand when you're talking about hostage taking and whatnot, looking back a little bit into the conversation here, there's a pretty big reason for why Israel, United States, doesn't want to designate Hamas the legitimate rulers of Gaza. And the point being is that the international law and laws of war actually dictate very different ways of treating militants that are not a part of a designated state, being Israel being a state. I'm not talking about state of the United States, but state being in most cases a country. there are very different laws of war. You don't have the ability to designate someone a prisoner of war. They can essentially just be a detention center occupant, and that is how Israel is treating it. But when you look at the amount of people that Israel holds to this day, it is estimated to be somewhere around 10,000 people. Whether they are militants or not is beside the point. You're talking about hostage deals where it's estimated that Gaza or Hamas is still holding roughly 90 to 100 hostages in Gaza from Israel. And you look at 10,000 on the other side and you wonder why these people being Gazans don't want to make a deal quite yet. To me, that makes perfect sense. If that was our country, if that was the United States, you think about how we've reacted to even the smallest engagements that have been taken on could be military folk or just be civilians. We've reacted very harshly in terms of absolutely decimating communities, countries, just for the simple problem of maybe knocking out one of our warships. So I think about how the United States would react in a scenario like this. I don't think there would be any bars holding back. And to this end, I think a lot of us Americans can actually sympathize with the Palestinian point of view here, where things are kind of lopsided against them. Not only is Israel a very formidable power in and of themselves, but they have the United States backing them. And especially with the Trump regime in power right now, you look back on to the first term underneath Trump starting in 2017 and lasting all the way through 2020, there was never a more pro-Israel president than President Trump. And it is a pretty scary proposition for Palestinians in order to face the fact that they're not going to get a good deal out of this. More than likely, their leadership is, if they're not already dead, they're going to be decimated and they're going to have to essentially vote in a new leadership, which at the end of the day, Palestinian people, and especially people living in Gaza, may actually be in support of Hamas for doing something about the fact that Israel has a pretty hard lock on their lives, how much damage they've done in terms of not only loss of life, but just the decimation of property, infrastructure, and everything else in between. So is there somewhere to go here? I would hope that Trump actually begins to hold Israel's feet to the fire here, especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, in terms of pushing them towards a permanent ceasefire. Just like we're seeing the treatment of Ukraine and trying to push them and Russia to the table, I think the same's got to be done for Israel. And I may have mentioned on a previous show that it seems like what the Trump administration has done is kind of taken the priority to make sure that they get the Ukrainian deal done first, Ukraine-Russia, and get theirs done first as a primary goal and a secondary goal being Israel. I think with the way things are going, or the way things seem to be stalling out between Russia and Ukraine, if it was my opinion, you got to get what done that you can with an actual ally, and that being Israel. Israel is one of the quote-unquote strongest allies of the United States over the past few decades here, and if that's actually true, then we should be able to hold our allies' feet to the fire and say, listen, you are not in search of goals that are amicable to the United States, and making sure they're pursuing those goals, which is, at the end of the day, their goals may be very different than what our goals should be. And if we can't guide them into some sort of place where we're all in agreement, well, then maybe we have to second guess about how much aid we're giving to this country. Just how much of an ally or how high on the priority list are they? I think that needs to be seriously considered. And to me, the way that things are looking, especially with that, as I mentioned, what Trump recently posted on, I think Instagram, Truth Social, he may have posted it everywhere. Looking at that video and seeing how he sees the Gazan people and how easily he thinks in his mind, apparently, that they can be displaced. To me, I think we are very possibly heading in the wrong direction in terms of getting a long-lasting peace worked out. And if you look at the broader scheme of things and you look back again to about how often the Israeli people are engaged in some sort of warfare with Palestinians or Gazans in particular, it seems to be about every 2 to 4 years. And if that's the case, why wouldn't they just do a quick ceasefire, wait until Trump is no longer in office, and go right back to war? And that's what I do fear for not actually committing to rebuilding the area for the Palestinian people, but committing to a U.S.-led or possibly United States-run area in Gaza. And if that's going to be the pursuit policy by the Trump administration, then I think that there's some real misalignment here between his voters and what he thinks that we want. Just to wrap it up, Hamas started in about 1987. When they started underneath their leader, Yassin was actually funded originally while he was running a peacetime organization by Israel. Now, Israel actually withheld that funding once Hamas started. Could you make the claim that Hamas was actually propped up by Israel? To a point, or at least you can make the argument that money may have shifted hands, but at the end of the day, once the militant group started, they did not actually receive funding from Israel themselves. And not only that, Israel did not push for the election of Gazans. They actually seemed to have stayed out of it. And with that being the case, it was a lot of U.S. pushed diplomacy in order to try to, in my eyes, try to push for a two-state solution. And that two-state solution seems to be the thing that Israel is fighting at this moment. Does not seem like they have any real leaning towards ever giving up Jerusalem. And why would they? This is a land that they have controlled for quite some time now, and it is viewed as the Holy Land. So with all that being said, I would hope that an end to this conflict is in the near future, but I wouldn't be too hopeful for it. And I wouldn't be expecting it. And the reason being is Israel's already breaking the ceasefire agreement. Now, is it after the phase 1 and phase 2 hasn't officially started? Yes. That being said, firing airstrikes off, withholding aid is not a good look in terms of trying to get to a solution that suits all parties. Is there going to be peace? Is there going to be a United States-run Riviera? That is going to have to be proven, or it's a sight that's yet to be seen. That's going to be the next steps here. And folks, I don't know what side of the aisle you're on. I don't know which side you're fighting for, but at the end of the day, you have people from very differing ideologies on both sides of this conflict, and we are in the United States, most of us anyway. And if you are a part of those groups, then I want you to leave your comments down below and tell me how you think. But if you're an American, I also want you to tell me, where do you think our place is in this war? Do we have any reason to be giving funding to the state of Israel anymore? Do we have a place in the world here to actually ensure aid gets to Gaza, which I'm kind of leaning for? Tell me what you think, because this is such a divisive conflict that many people are just assuming the absolute worst of the other side, or people who are living thousands of miles away from the conflict and have an opinion. So again, tell me what you think. Tell me where you think the United States has a role to play, if any, and tell me if you think like me and like many others, if you agree that Trump's stance so far in terms of attempting to rebuild Gaza under the United States' purview, if that's the wrong direction to go. Because, again, myself, I could not be any more upset with the way the Trump administration has been handling this conflict, and I hope that they're able to hold our allies' feet to the fire and make them go at this in a more humane way in terms of, you have a neighboring country or neighboring set of people, if you don't want to term Gaza a country, which they technically are not. But you do have a set of people that are looking to become a state, for sure, and may not be as Americans in support of the leadership there, but who is it for us to say? Is it our place to say who should be leading Gaza, or should it be a vote taken upon by the Gazan people? That's really all I got for today. I hope you enjoyed. And again, if you are interested in some more information on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, I implore you to go look at some older episodes that we have done. Again, this is probably going on about 3 hours of content now. So there's a lot going back all the way to the beginning movements of immigration in the late 1800s into the Palestinian territory by European Jews, and then heading into mid-1900s, creation of a state in Israel in 1948, and the ensuing conflicts that's been going on for the decades since. Again, I'm Sal Assante with We The Patriots Podcast. Be sure to share this with friends if you enjoyed the show, if you have enjoyed the show, and let's get some more people in the movement here. Catch you guys next week. Peace out.
I want to be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.